we want to have an image of Israel as a country that is a democracy struggling for its security, but wanting to find solutions. But that really has gone away over the last 20 years. And I would say we have to go back 50 years to understand what is happening right now. It's pretty shocking. But 50 years ago, precisely 57 years ago, was the Six-Day War, the 1967 war. And at the end of that war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories, three: Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And then came the question what to do. Well, the UN Security Council already in 1967 said you can't keep conquered territory. This is going to have to be returned. And therein began the discussion of the so-called two-state solution, in which there would be Israel, there would be Palestine, they would live side by side. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a plan was hatched for Israel to settle these occupied territories, to put settlements in them. Now, these settlements were illegal because this was trying to make permanent an occupation which was already declared by the UN Security Council unacceptable in UN Security Council Resolution 242. But the plan, which was launched by a leading politician general at the time, Yigal Allon, said, no, we're going to put facts on the ground. And that was the phrase that became the coin of the realm: facts on the ground. We're just going to go ahead and do this. But then something more happened, and it's really, it's depressing, and it's important to understand. This became not only a security tactic, right or wrong, it became a zealous religious movement. And this is something really strange, hard for us to fathom, but extremely important in understanding Israel today. And that is under the weight of some very influential Rebbe's, the idea became a zealous idea that the return of these Palestinian territories to Israel was part of God's plan, and that this was land that was promised by God to the Jewish people, so it should never be returned. In other words, it went from a tactic of security to an article of faith in the literal sense of nationalist religious zealotry. And there are parts of the First Testament, the Old Testament, especially the book of Joshua and other parts, which, if you're a biblical literalist, excuse me, it says, well, all this land is Jewish land. And an absolutely zealous movement started. I happened to see that close up in visits to Israel 40 years ago, something called Gush Emonim, a settlement movement. It became religious fervor that this is our land. We will never give it back. God gave it to the Jewish people. And that movement spread, as did the settlements. There are now an estimated 700,000 Israeli settlers. And a large part of the cabinet in Israel represents this settler movement. And it is violent. It is not extremist in a security sense, in a religious sense. It is biblical. It is zealotry. And it says this is our land, period, full stop. And one of the leaders of this settler movement is Smotrich, probably the most right-wing of an extremely right-wing government right now. He was at that rally in Tel Aviv. And the idea is, of course, no compromise. This is ours, pure and simple. Now, that kind of zealotry is devastating for Israel, of course, for Palestine, it prevents even the possibility of peace. And that's where we are. And the Biden administration hides this because our nice AIPAC, Israel lobby and so forth puts a completely different face on what Israel is from what Israel actually is right now politically, which is an extremist, religious, nationalist zealotry at the core of this government, which would make it completely impossible to have peace. Now, I'm not saying that represents all of Israel. I'm saying that's what this government is. And
Right.
Biden does not have the wherewithal, the gumption, the standing, the forcefulness, the leadership to explain this to the American people or to the Israeli government. And that's why they're just wringing their hands. They don't know what to do. I think that they regret what's happening to an important extent, but they're very weak, this government. And the people, American people, don't like it. They don't understand it, but it's not been explained to them properly. And the president of the United States should not put up with this approach, which is devastating for Israel, for any kind of peace, for the Palestinian people, and for American security and foreign policy.
I mean, there are people who are going to hear that and say, well, I think it's ideological. There has been a trend throughout Joe Biden's entire political career where he has gone above and beyond in demonstrating his allegiance, or maybe that's the right word, maybe that's not, but his, let's say, unity of interest, personal affinity for Israel.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
And that he is not explaining it to the American people properly because he does not share what you've just articulated in terms of your understanding of the right-wing nature of Israel's government at the moment. And so when people look at this latest development, which is that President Biden issued an executive order on Thursday sanctioning 4 Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank who are accused of violence against Palestinians. The order imposes travel bans, lays the groundwork for financial sanctions against settlers who carry out violent assaults. That is really a demonstration that he knows that there's a problem, but is unwilling to do anything more than a de minimis sanctioning of 4 settlers. Now, keep in mind that, as you mentioned, there are hundreds of thousands of settlers now in the West Bank, 60,000 of whom are American citizens, which is a kind of a mind-blowing prospect. Mm-hmm. That the Israeli government arms these settlers, extends protection to these settlers. Part of the internal frustrations within Israel at the moment is that there was arguably lax security on October 7th at the border with Gaza, in part because security had been reassigned to these settlers elsewhere in the country. And that the fact that of these kind of stories, it enables Biden to say, look, I'm doing something. I'm doing something to address the fact that hundreds of Palestinians in the West Bank, nowhere near Gaza, in the West Bank, have been killed by these settlers since October 7th in an opportunistic way. I know that there's a problem. I have even the framework to address it, but I'm not going to do anything meaningful. I mean, what do you say to people who say, well, this is just more evidence that Biden knows better and doesn't want to act?
Well, I think in some sense that's absolutely right, because it's not only all the facts that you just accurately recited, but the fact that there are 26,000 dead in Gaza and 2 million people displaced, and in front of our eyes, cold-blooded murder inside hospitals, on the streets of Gaza, demolition of universities, demolition of schools, demolition of apartment buildings. So yes, Biden knows what's going on. They do know what's going on. My point was they mumble. He mumbles, the president, two-state solution.
Not only do we pray for peace We are actively working for peace, security, dignity for the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. I'm engaged in this day and night. I'm working, as many of you in this room are, to find the means to bring our hostages home, to ease the humanitarian crisis, and to bring peace to Gaza and Israel, and enduring peace with two states for two peoples.
Probably would want it. When I speak to administration officials, they say, "Oh, we want a two-state solution." What they don't, I think, deeply accept or explain or react to is that the Israeli government, as clear as can be, day by day, not only by the murderous actions, but by the statements as well, absolutely reject what we say we want. And yet we are arming, funding, making it possible for that war to go on day by day and do nothing about it. That's just profound weakness. And I'm guessing, I don't know what's really in the president's mind on this, but I'm guessing that like politicians of his generation, he and his personal predilections, as you pointed out, believe don't ever show any space with Israel on anything. Right. But the fact of the matter is, Israel is different today with this extreme right-wing religious nationalism than what the American people think it is. And that's what we're actually seeing right now.
I want to ask you some more questions about what's going on with the kind of public representations coming out of the Biden administration that seem to be in direct conflict with the substantive material actions that it's taken. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield has given a number of statements, including speaking positively about the value of UNRWA. Obviously, the United States has suspended funding to UNRWA following these initial accusations that about 12 UNRWA aid workers were involved on October 7th. They then broadened the claim. The Washington Post published a story that was written by someone who later came out was themselves in the IDF and seemed to be reporting based on an Israeli intelligence dossier, which has not been independently confirmed by our own government, that it was up to 10% of UNRWA staffers. Then they clarified that 10% of UNRWA staffers had, quote, connections to Hamas. Some of those connections are as flimsy as has close relatives that are in Hamas. So you see how this is going. Despite having suspended aid and 9 other of our allies suspending aid, which substantively cuts into UNRWA's budget, Linda Thomas Greenfield has said things like UNRWA is really valuable. We're looking forward to restoring the budget as soon as these claims are vetted. The obvious question of why you wouldn't wait till the claims are vetted to suspend much needed aid that's staving off a broad famine that's emerging is an obvious question. But what do you make of her saying things like that, like the State Department, our government, saying just a week or so before cutting this aid, suspending this aid, how valuable UNRWA assistant was, and then being able to go out to the public and say, of course we support these workers, of course we support this aid going out, we're just going to manifestly not give it.
Go ahead. Thank you, Matt. In light of a January 9 Israel Knesset member-led meeting in the Knesset condemning the UN agency, UNRWA, for fostering a welfare-dependent Palestinian population that breeds dissent and teaches children in their textbooks that the land is Palestine and Israel is the illegal occupier, with other instruction to hate and kill Jews, plus their association with terrorist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Authority. What is Secretary Blinken's response to Knesset members Sharon Haskell and Simcha Rotman, who are calling for the funding of UNRWA to stop? And I have a follow-up. So I'm not going to respond to the comments by individual members of the Knesset, but I will say that UNRWA has done and continues to do invaluable work to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza at great personal risk to UNRWA members. I believe it's over 100 UNRWA staff members have been killed doing this life-saving work, and we continue to not only support it, but we continue to commend them for the really heroic efforts that they make oftentimes while making the greatest sacrifice. The follow-up is, how can you expect Israel and other nations to believe that the UN agency, UNRWA, is a credible humanitarian agency since, according to Jerusalem Post reports, UNRWA teachers and students celebrated Hamas' brutal attack on Israel October 7, and over half of the Hamas terrorists behind that massacre were graduates of UNRWA schools in Gaza, and weapons were found in UNRWA schools.
Well, I think most people in Gaza are graduates of UNRWA schools. They are one of the leading, if not the leading, providers of education. So I think that's a little bit of a there's a little bit of a breakdown in logic there. But I will say, I'll answer the question by saying, look, whenever we see reports of that nature, we ask specific questions about UNRWA and ask that they be followed up. It does not change the life-saving work that UNRWA is doing every day in Gaza that I just detailed a moment ago.
Well, remember that our ambassador to the UN feels probably more than anyone in Washington the total isolation of the United States in world opinion and in the attitudes of the other governments of the world other than Israel itself. There was a UN General Assembly vote calling for political self-determination of the Palestinian people, in which four out of the 193 UN member states voted against. What were those four countries? That was Israel, of course, the United States, Micronesia, which by compact has to vote with the United States, and Nauru, a country of 12,000 people. In other words, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield knows we're completely isolated globally. Nobody believes what the United States is doing. Nobody accepts it. Nobody backs this massacre in Gaza. And so she's reflecting that. In Washington, they don't feel it day by day the same way. And what they also are not taking into account is that with the International Court of Justice ruling, every action, every day is now being recorded and monitored against the ruling that the court made. In other words, the clock has started and everything is being watched, including the U.S. actions as well. So the U.S. government absolutely is on notice. It is shocking. 26,000 dead in Gaza, 2 million displaced, and one news story put out by Israel and the United States and about a dozen allies cancel the aid in the context of a devastating hunger crisis facing hundreds of thousands of people, canceled the support for the very organization, the only one that is charged with overcoming the famine. So this is complicity in genocide, if this is the way that the United States is going to act. It is a pretty damn uncomfortable place to be. And that's what the ambassador is trying to convey. But, you know, she takes her orders from Washington of how to vote.
I mean, the implicit read here is that America is exploiting the threat of famine. Is saying, well, we'd love to start this aid up, but I think it was Linda Thomas Greenfield who said something along the lines of, we're hoping that this will facilitate the negotiations around a ceasefire. Like, oh yes, we're all hoping the aid can start again, and that's why we need a ceasefire, which is basically saying, yes, we're going to use collective punishment to try to improve our bargaining position here, and which is obviously a war crime. So I wondered if you could speak to the status of there actually being some resolution. It does seem like every week we're told they're very close to negotiating a ceasefire in exchange for hostages, but that ceasefire never comes to fruition. What's your understanding of how close those negotiations are to actually manifesting in a ceasefire?
Obviously, I'm not close enough to give you an hour by hour reading of where this stands, but there is an absolutely fundamental point, which is that if one has a ceasefire and then one asks what comes next, at some moment one needs to reach the politics of this. The politics is more than a ceasefire for an exchange of hostages. It is who controls Gaza, what's going to happen next. And there are two possibilities, basically. The Israeli government says explicitly every day, we will control Gaza. Well, there can be no peace on that basis. And my guess is no ceasefire even that then would lead to that outcome at the end of a period. The other possibility is what is part of international law now for 57 years, and that is a Palestinian state. My own view is that the UN Security Council, and of course it would do it if the US would not veto it, should immediately recognize a Palestinian state as the 194th member state of the United Nations up front, not at the end of a process, but up front. The rest can follow, but I would make that the fact on which all the rest happens so that it's negotiations between two sovereign states. And this, to my mind, would flip the kind of phony process and the failed process of the last dozens of years in which, a Palestinian state will come at the end, and the end proves to be the end of the rainbow. Never.
The end of what exactly?
Yes, we need, exactly. And that's why all of these processes have failed, because fundamentally there is, since the 1970s, and especially since the 1990s, and certainly today, there is a absolutely hardcore, extreme religious nationalist right in Israel that either has had the swing vote or had the dominant position in government to block that. But the whole world suffers as a result of that. Global peace suffers as a result of that, not to mention the Palestinian people suffering as a result of that. And I believe the UN Security Council should impose its will, which has been on the books for 57 years, and that is that there will be two states, and this will start up front now.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.